All right, welcome back to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our series on Thomas Sowell's Discriminations and Disparities with the second half of Chapter 4, which is entitled The World of Numbers. We're going to be reading the subsection Errors of Commission tonight. There is a pretty lengthy sidebar within the middle of this chapter, and I think that the way that this best reads is to just read it straight through as it's written, rather than saving it for later on in the chapter or at the end of the chapter and coming back to it. So if you think that this kind of reads out of place, just let me know in the comment section. I'm just making that judgment call for now. So without further ado, errors of commission. Statistical errors of commission include lumping together data on things that are fundamentally different, such as salaries and capital gains, producing numbers that are simply called income. Other errors of commission include discussing statistical brackets as if they represented a given set of flesh and blood human beings called the rich, the poor, or the top 1%, for example. Errors of commission also include using survey research to resolve factual issues that the inherent limitations of survey research make it unable to resolve. Capital gains. While annual income statistics for individuals avoid some of the problems of household income statistics, both of these sets of statistics count income 1, annual salaries earned in a given year, and 2, income from capital gains accrued over some previous span of years, and then turned into cash income during a given year. Treating the incomes earned by some individuals over various numbers of years as being the same incomes as earned by other individuals in just 1 year is like failing to distinguish apples from oranges. Capital gains take many forms from many very different kinds of transactions. These transactions range from sales of stock and bonds that may have been bought years earlier to sales of a home or business that has increased in value over the years. If a farm was purchased for $100,000 and then 20 years later, after the farmer has built barns and fences and made other improvements to the land and the structures on it, the farm is then sold for $300,000. That sale will result in a net increase of the owner's income by $200,000 in the particular year when the farm is sold. Statistically, that $200,000 that was earned over a period of 20 years will be recorded the same as a $200,000 salary earned by someone else in just 1 year. Looking back, that farmer has in reality earned an average of $10,000 a year for 20 years as increases in the value of the farm through the investment of time, work, and money on the farm. Looking forward, the farmer cannot expect to earn another $200,000 the following year as someone with a $200,000 annual salary can. Capital gains in general are recorded in income statistics as being the same as an annual salary, when clearly they are not. Nor is there some easy formula available to render salaries and capital gains comparable, because capital gains by different individuals accrue for differing numbers of years before being turned into cash income in a given year. If capital gains were equally present at all income levels, say 10% of all incomes being capital gains, then the disparities in income statistics might not be affected much. But in reality, low annual incomes are far more likely to be salaries, and very high annual incomes are far more likely to be capital gains. While people making $20,000 a year are probably getting that from a salary, people making $20 million a year are more likely to be making such a sum of money from capital gains of one sort or another. The exceptionally high rates of turnover of people at very high income levels reinforce this conclusion. Internal Revenue Service data show that half the people who earned over $1 million a year at some time during the years from 1999 to 2007 did so just once in those 9 years. This does not imply that all others in that bracket made $1 million every year. Another study, also based on tax data, show that among Americans with the 400 highest incomes in the country, fewer than 13% were in that very high bracket more than twice during the years from 1992 to 2000. The highest incomes are usually very transient incomes, reinforcing the conclusion that these are transient capital gains rather than enduring salaries. All of this distorts the implications of income statistics that treat annual salaries and multi-year capital gains as if they were the same. Talk of how much of a country's income is received by the top 10% or top 1% proceeds as if this is a given set of people when, because of the high turnover in high income brackets, there can be thousands of people in the top 400 during just one decade. When incomes received by thousands of people are reported statistically as if these were incomes received by hundreds of people, that is a several-fold exaggeration of income disparities. Sidebar: Capital gains and inequality. A hypothetical example may illustrate how income statistics can exaggerate inequality when they make no distinction between 1. People who receive annual salaries in a given year, and 2. People who receive capital gains in that same year, representing income earned over a previous span of years. If, for example, there are 10 people who are in a high income bracket, each earning $500,000 a year, while there are also 10 people in a lower income bracket, each earning $50,000 a year, it might seem as if there is a 10-to-1 difference in income between people in those two brackets. But if only one of the 10 people in the higher bracket is earning $500,000 every year in a decade, while the others are there for just 1 year each in that decade, the year in which their accrued capital gains are turned into cash income, then given the very high rate of turnover in very high income brackets, the situation is very different from what it would be if there were the same 10 people in the higher bracket every year of the decade. If most of the people in the higher income bracket have a 1-year spike in income from capital gains, after which they return to some lower level of income, which may be still above the national average, say an individual income of $100,000 a year, then over the course of a decade, the income disparity between people is substantially less than the income disparity between income brackets. In this hypothetical example, where there are 9 people initially in the higher income bracket earning $500,000 each in the first year covered, and $100,000 in each of the subsequent 9 years of the decade, that adds up to a total of $1.4 million each during that decade, which in turn adds up to $12.6 million for all 9 people collectively. The 10th member of this top bracket, who is in that bracket every year for the decade, receiving $500,000 a year in all 10 years, has a total income of $5 million. For all these particular 10 people put together, that adds up to $17.6 million received collectively in a decade by the 10 people initially in the higher bracket. Meanwhile, among the 10 people in the lower income bracket receiving $50,000 a year each initially and throughout the decade, that adds up to $500,000 each in a decade for a total income of $5 million as a group. With the 10 people initially in the higher bracket earning a total of $17.6 million during that same decade, and the 10 people initially in the lower bracket earning a total of $5 million during that decade, the disparity in income between people is less than 4-to-1, while the disparity in income between their respective income brackets is 10-to-1. That is because 9 of the 10 people in the higher bracket are replaced each year by someone else having a 1-year spike in income from capital gains for an income of $500,000 in this example. Counting all 91 people who are in the higher income bracket at some point during the decade, their average annual incomes are less than 3 times that of the people in the lower bracket. Although this exercise assumes, for the sake of simplicity, that people in the lower income bracket have constant incomes throughout the decade, data from the real world shows the incomes of people initially in lower income brackets to usually be rising over time more sharply than the incomes of people initially in higher brackets. This would make the disparity in incomes between people in these two brackets, even less than that in this example. A hypothetical example cannot pretend to be an exact replica of the real world. The point is merely to illustrate how, under some approximation of these conditions, the disparities between income brackets can be much greater than the disparities between actual flesh and blood human beings. And that concludes Thomas Sowell's sidebar, so we're returning to the main text. Racial and ethnic disparities. In trying to determine the reasons for economic and social disparities between blacks and whites, some observers attribute these differences primarily to policies and practices by people outside the black community, while other observers attribute these same differences to internal differences in behavior between black and white Americans. In seeking to resolve this issue, sociologist William Julius Wilson relied heavily on statistics from opinion surveys. These surveys, according to Professor Wilson, show that, quote, nearly all ghetto residents, whether employed or not, support the norms of the work ethic, end quote. In one survey, quote, fewer than 3% of the black respondents from ghetto poverty census tracts denied the importance of plain hard work for getting ahead in society, and 66% expressed the view that it is very important, end quote. After admitting that, quote, surveys are not the best way to get at underlying attitudes and values, end quote, Professor Wilson nevertheless presents as a refutation of, quote, media perceptions of underclass values and attitudes, end quote, in inner-city ghettos, the fact that, quote, residents in inner-city ghetto neighborhoods actually verbally endorse, rather than undermine, the basic American values concerning individual initiative, end quote. Despite William Julius Wilson's reliance on opinion surveys to refute claims that ghetto residents have different cultural values from those of the American population as a whole, there is no necessary correlation between what people say and what they do. A survey of low-income people by Columbia University researchers showed that 59% regarded buying goods on credit as a bad idea. Nevertheless, quote, most of the families do use credit when buying major durables, end quote. The difference between survey results and demonstrable realities was also pointed out by the author of Hillbilly Elegy. Quote, in a recent Gallup poll, Southerners and Midwesterners reported the highest rates of church attendance in the country, yet actual church attendance is much lower in the South, end quote. He also found another survey indicating that working-class whites worked more hours than college-educated whites to be, quote, demonstrably false, end quote. Those who did the survey, quote, called around and asked people what they thought. The only thing that report proves is that many folks talk about working more than they actually work, end quote. If someone with no pretensions of being an academic scholar could see the tenuous relationship between survey results and the realities of life, it is hard to understand why surveys were relied on by Professor Wilson for deciding such a crucial issue as the internal or external sources of racial differences in socioeconomic outcomes. Economists tend to rely on, quote, revealed preference, end quote, rather than verbal statements. That is, what people do reveals what their values are better than what they say. Even when people give honest answers, expressing what they sincerely believe, some people's conception of hard work, for example, need not coincide with other people's conception, even when both use the same words. When black students in affluent Shaker Heights spent less time on their schoolwork than their white classmates did, and spent more time watching television, that was their revealed preference. Nor are black and white Americans the only groups with different revealed preferences. In Australia, for example, Chinese students have spent more than twice as much time on their homework as white students did. How surprised should we be that Asian students in general tend to do better academically than white students in general in predominantly white societies, such as Australia, Britain, or the United States? The same pattern can be seen among whole nations, as such Asian countries as Japan, Korea, and Singapore likewise show patterns of hard work by their students and academic results on international tests that place these countries well above most Western nations. Statistics compiled from what people say may be worse than useless if they lead to a belief that those numbers convey a reality that can be relied on for serious decision-making about social policies. Incidentally, the high correlation between the amount of work that different groups put into their education and the quality of their outcomes does not bode well for theories of genetic determinism. When we find some race whose lazy students get educational results superior to the results of hardworking students in other races, this would be evidence supporting that hypothesis, but such evidence does not seem to be available. Minimum wages and unemployment. One of the important areas in which survey research has done major damage has been in trying to resolve differences of opinion as to the effect of minimum wage laws on employment. Advocates of minimum wage laws argue that such laws raise the income of the poor, while critics argue that these laws cause more of the poor to be unemployed, because low-income workers tend to be workers with few skills and or little work experience, so that employers find them worth employing only at low-wage rates. Despite an abundance of detailed statistics on unemployment, this controversy has raged for generations. Part of the problem is that, as we have seen in other contexts, most of what are called the poor are not permanent residents in low-income brackets any more than other people are permanent residents in other income brackets. Most of the people being paid the minimum wage rate are young workers, and of course they do not remain young over the years. So when people say, as Senator Ted Kennedy once said, quote, "Minimum wage workers have waited almost 10 long years for an increase," end quote, they are not talking about a given set of human beings, but about a statistical category containing an ever-changing mix of people. Because young people are usually, almost by definition, less experienced workers, their value to a prospective employer tends to be less than the value of more experienced workers in the same line of work. Some young people may acquire valuable work skills through education, but education also takes time, and people grow older with the passage of that time. Often what younger, inexperienced workers acquire from an entry-level job is primarily the habit of showing up every day and on time, and the habit of following instructions and getting along with others. But, simple as such things may seem, the absence of these prerequisites can negate whatever other good qualities a young worker may have. After having acquired work experience in some principal, entry-level job, most young beginners go on to other jobs where work experience of some sort may be a prerequisite for getting hired. Higher rates of employee turnover, sometimes exceeding 100% per year, are common in many entry-level jobs in retail businesses or fast food restaurants. These jobs are stepping stones to other jobs with other employers, though some observers falsely call entry-level jobs, quote, dead-end jobs, end quote. If workers in fact stayed on permanently in such jobs, which usually have no automatic promotion ladder, those workers would in fact be in dead-end jobs. But when the average tenure of supermarket employees has been found to be 97 days, that is clearly not the case. Like most things in a market economy, inexperienced and unskilled workers are more in demand at a lower price than at a higher price. Minimum wage laws, based on what third parties would like to see them paid, rather than being based on productivity, can price unskilled workers out of a job. This traditional economic analysis has been challenged by advocates of minimum wage laws, and survey research data has been a major part of that challenge. Back in 1945, Professor Richard A. Lester of Princeton University sent out questionnaires to employers, asking how they would respond to higher labor costs. Their responses, which were not along the lines of traditional economic analysis, convinced Professor Lester that the traditional economic analysis was either incorrect or not applicable to minimum wage laws. However, what traditional economic analysis seems to do is predict economic outcomes, not predict how people will answer questionnaires. Moreover, outcomes are not just the fruition of beliefs or intentions, as we have seen in discussions of the cost of discrimination. Decades after Professor Lester's challenge to traditional economic analysis, other economists, also at Princeton, again challenged traditional economic analysis on the basis of survey research, though this time by surveying the same employers before and after a minimum wage increase and asking each time how many employees they had. The answers convinced the Princeton economists that the minimum wage increase had not reduced unemployment. They and their supporters therefore declared the traditional analysis to be a myth. Devastating criticisms of the Princeton economists' conclusions were made by other economists, who challenged both the accuracy of their statistics and the logic of their conclusions. But even if the Princeton economist statistics were accurate, they would still not address the key weakness of survey research in general, which is that you can only survey survivors. And what may be true of survivors need not be true of others in the same circumstances who did not survive in those particular circumstances. An extreme hypothetical example may illustrate the point that is applicable in less extreme situations. If you wish to determine whether playing Russian roulette was dangerous, and did so through survey research, you might send out questionnaires to all individuals known to have played Russian roulette, asking them for information as to their outcomes. After the questionnaires were returned and the answers tabulated, the conclusions from these statistics might well be that no one was harmed at all, judging by the answers on the questionnaires that were returned. Not all questionnaires would have been returned, but that is not uncommon in survey research. Basing your conclusions on the statistical data from this research, you might well conclude that you have disproved the myth that playing Russian roulette was dangerous. This is the kind of result you can get when you can only survey survivors. In the case of minimum wage studies, if all the firms in an industry were identical, then any reduced employment resulting from the imposition of a minimum wage or the raising of an existing minimum wage rate would appear as a reduction of unemployment in all the firms. But in the more usual case, where some firms in a given industry are quite profitable, others are less profitable, and still others are struggling to survive, unemployment resulting from a minimum wage can push some struggling firms out of the industry and reduce the number of their replacements now that labor costs are higher and profits more problematical. The only firms that can be surveyed from their employment data, both before and after the minimum wage was imposed or raised, are the firms that were there in both time periods, that is, the survivors. If there has been a net decrease in the number of firms, the unemployment in these surviving firms need not have gone down at all, regardless of a decline in employment in the industry as a whole. The firms surveyed are like the people who survived playing Russian roulette, which may well be a majority in both cases, though not an indicative majority. Empirically, a study of the effect of minimum wages on employment in restaurants in the San Francisco Bay Area found that the principal effect was through some restaurants going out of business and reducing the number of new firms entering to replace them. Those restaurants going out of business were primarily restaurants rated lower in quality. Employment in five-star restaurants was unaffected. In Seattle as well, the response to a higher local minimum wage rate increase was that a number of restaurants simply closed down. A study published by the National Bureau of Economic Research measured employment by hours of work, as well as by the number of workers employed, and concluded that, quote, the minimum wage ordinance lowered low-wage employees' earnings by an average of $125 per month in 2016, end quote. Thus, a theoretical increase in income from a higher minimum wage became, in the real world, a significant decrease in income. Another problem with trying to determine the effect of a minimum wage law on unemployment is that the proportion of the workforce directly affected by a minimum wage is often small. Therefore, unemployment among that fraction of the workforce can be swamped by fluctuations in the unemployment rate among the larger number of other employees around them. This is less of a problem in situations where most of the employees are earning a wage low enough to be directly affected by a minimum wage law. But five-star restaurants were unlikely to be having inexperienced teenagers delivering food to their customers' tables, even if restaurants like McDonald's or Burger King often have teenagers delivering food over the counter to their customers. Alternative ways of assessing the effect of a minimum wage on unemployment would include gathering data restricted to just the kinds of inexperienced and unskilled workers directly affected, such as teenagers. We have already seen in Chapter 2 how minimum wage laws affect both teenage unemployment in general and racial disparities in teenage unemployment rates as well. Yet another way of assessing the effect of minimum wage laws on unemployment would be to gather unemployment data on places and times where there have been no minimum wage laws at all, so that these unemployment rates could be compared to unemployment rates in places and times where there have been minimum wage laws, especially where these have been comparable societies or, ideally, the very same society in the same era, with and without a minimum wage law. By focusing on teenagers in general, or black teenagers in particular, it is possible to see the effects of minimum wage laws more clearly and precisely, since these are workers on whom such laws have their greatest impact, because these are a population most lacking in education, job skills, and experience, and therefore earning especially low wage rates. Moreover, there are extensive statistics on what happened to these populations in the labor markets from the late 1940s to the present. What is most striking about statistics on American teenage unemployment rates in the late 1940s is that 1. These unemployment rates were only a fraction of the levels of unemployment to which we have become accustomed to seeing in later decades, and 2. There was little or no difference between the unemployment rates of blacks and white teenagers then. Internationally, unemployment rates have been markedly lower in times and places where neither governments nor labor unions set most wage rates. Most modern nations have had minimum wage laws, but the few that have not have tended to have strikingly lower unemployment rates. These would include Switzerland and Singapore today, and Hong Kong under British rule prior to the 1997 return of Hong Kong to China. There was also no federal minimum wage law in the United States before the Davis-Bacon Act of 1931, which impacted wage rates in the construction industry. As far as hard data on unemployment rates in these places and times, The Economist magazine reported in 2003, quote, Switzerland's unemployment neared a 5-year high of 3.9% in February, end quote. But this high for Switzerland unemployment rate returned to a more normal, for Switzerland, 3.1% in later years. In 2013, Singapore's unemployment rate was 2.1%. In 1991, when Hong Kong was still a British colony, it too had no minimum wage law, and its unemployment rate was under 2%. In the United States, the last administration with no federal minimum wage law at any time was the Coolidge administration of the 1920s. During President Coolidge's last 4 years in office, the annual unemployment rate ranged from a high of 4.2% to a low of 1.8%. Yet discussions of minimum wage laws, even by academic scholars, are often based on the intentions and presumed effects of these laws, rather than being based on empirical evidence as to their actual consequences. Implications. On the larger question of statistical errors in general, whether errors of omission or commission, these errors often seem to support a particular social vision. This suggests the possibility that pursuit of a social cause can affect how causation is perceived or presented to others. Even in the absence of any such concerns, however, the emphasis on complex statistical analysis in economics and other fields, however valuable or even vital such statistical analysis may be in many cases, can lead to overlooking simple but fundamental questions as to whether the numbers on which these complex analyses are based are in fact measuring what they seem to be measuring or claim to be measuring. Income statistics, which lump together annual salaries and multi-year capital gains, are just one of the many sets of statistics which could stand much closer scrutiny at this fundamental level, especially if laws and policies affecting millions of human beings are to be based on statistical conclusions. More broadly, the validity of numbers in general often depends on the reliability of the words describing what those numbers are measuring. Statistics on tax rates, for example, can be grossly misleading when changes in tax rates are described in such terms as, quote, a $300 billion increase in taxes, end quote, or a, quote, $300 billion decrease in taxes, end quote. All that the government can do in reality is change the tax rate. How much tax revenue that will produce depends on how people react. There have been some times when higher tax rates have produced lower tax revenues, and some other times when lower tax rates have produced higher tax revenues. In the 1920s, for example, the tax rate on the highest income was reduced from 73% to 24%, and the income tax revenue rose substantially, especially tax revenues received from people in the highest income brackets. Under the older and higher tax rate, vast sums of money from wealthy investors were sheltered in tax-exempt securities, such as municipal bonds, an amount estimated to be 3 times the size of the annual federal budget and more than half as large as the national debt. Tax-exempt securities tend to not receive as high a rate of return on investments as other securities, whose earnings are taxed. What this meant was that sufficiently lower tax rates made it profitable for wealthy investors to take their money out of tax shelters and invest it in the market economy, where there was a higher rate of earnings, leaving them better off on net balance even after paying income taxes that they have avoided before. In terms of words on paper, the official tax rate was cut from 73% to 24% in the 1920s. But in terms of events in the real world, the tax rate actually paid on staggering sums of money previously hidden in tax shelters rose from 0% to 24%. This produced huge increases in tax revenues received from high-income people, both absolutely and as a percentage of all income taxes collected. That is because 24% of something is larger than 73% of nothing. Tax rates cut in some later administrations also led to increases in tax revenue. For example, a front-page news story in the New York Times of July 9, 2006 said, quote, an unexpectedly steep rise in tax revenues from corporations and the wealthy is driving down the projected budget deficit this year, end quote. However unexpected this increase in tax revenues after tax rates had been cut may have been to the New York Times, others who had been following economic history would know that this had happened before under administrations of both political parties. But none of these facts has made the slightest difference to those who continue to call tax rate reductions, quote, tax cuts for the rich, end quote, even when high-income people end up paying more tax revenue than before. The very possibility that tax rates and tax revenues can move in opposite directions has seldom been mentioned in the media, a crucial error of omission. Similarly, people who discuss raising the government-mandated minimum wage rate talk as if this would automatically mean having the lowest-paid workers' income rise from $10 an hour to $15 per hour, for example. In reality, for millions of inexperienced and unskilled young workers, it can mean that the wages they receive in fact fall from $10 an hour to $0 when they are unable to find jobs. Even those who have and keep their jobs can nevertheless end up with lower incomes as a result of having fewer hours of work available in the wake of a minimum wage increase, as a National Bureau of Economic Research study showed happened in Seattle in 2016, for example. Statistics matter greatly, but so do the words used to describe those statistics. Unless we are prepared to stop and think beyond the words to the realities, we are all too likely to be manipulated and stampeded by a heavy mixture of numbers and rhetoric. All right, that concludes Chapter 4. We will continue with Chapter 5 in our next read, which is entitled Social Visions and Human Consequences. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.